Up next, coverage of a news conference held today by Benjamin Begin, a member of Israel's Knesset for the ruling Likud party. Mr. Begin explained to reporters that the upcoming Middle East peace conference could be hurt if the United States tries to impose concessions on Israel. Mr. Begin's father, Menachem Begin, led Israel to its first and only peace treaty with an Arab nation, Egypt. We now turn to today's news conference.
Fine, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome all to the Embassy of Israel. I'm Ruth Yaron, press counselor for the Embassy of Israel, and we are delighted to have here this morning member of Knesset, Benny Begin. Mr. Begin has arrived to Washington yesterday and he will be staying in town for a couple of days. Mr. Benny Begin, currently a member of Knesset, is a chairman of the subcommittee on the National Security Policy and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. By profession, Mr. Begin is a geologist. He's a Jerusalemite living in Jerusalem, married, and a father of 6 children. We will start with Mr. Benny Begin presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we will move on to question and answer. Mr. Begin, please.
Thank you. Want to stuck it somehow? All right. You okay? All right. Shalom, good morning to everyone. I'm still on the lag a little bit. I just arrived yesterday and I'm pushed around by diligent people over here. So please bear with me if some of my English vocabulary sometime flies. I'd like to start in relevance to the upcoming negotiations in Madrid, or their opening ceremony there, to relate to you a story that has to do with my geological background as briefly portrayed by our press lady. I was drafted about 3 years ago by my party from my geology, and at the time I was in Colorado. I was on a sabbatical there and I had bold time. What I was doing there that summer of '88, I was informed at the time that there is a problem between the government of Colorado and the Federal Forest Service on the use of water resources on Federal Forest Service lands. And I was asked to try and build up a certain computer expert system to help them reach at least some basis of information and maybe some compromise. I did it. Didn't take too long. At one point in time, I found myself in Denver, sitting in a hall about that size, with a battery of attorneys for the Forest Service on one side, and a battery of attorneys for the government of Colorado on the other side, with an overhead projector with my transparencies over the wall here. And I told them about the plan, the general concept, the initial results. And at one point in time, I took myself off the scene, and they were arguing with me and between themselves. And at that point, I said, oh, how nice. Here is an Israeli coming to Colorado, sitting in the middle of 2 groups of attorneys and telling them, gentlemen, please, you can reach a compromise. I'll show you the way. I came back to Denver last year, that is 2 years later. No compromise. The litigations are in, the depositions are in, costs the American taxpayer millions of dollars. And the lesson, I think, is rather clear. It is a little bit difficult to try to impose or even advise from across the ocean any kind of a compromise when the differences are inherent in the situation. But in that sense of a compromise and the quest for a compromise and a peaceful solution to a long-term, standing, difficult, bloody struggle between Arabs and Jews, between the Jewish nation and the Arab nation in the Middle East, I'd like to have some comments on the upcoming negotiations, when they start, if they start. I think that you could say that there is a blend of positive and less positive conditions for a hope for positive results of these negotiations. Let's start with some of the less positive developments. I'll try to subdivide the negotiations between those relating to the Syrian-Israeli issues and those relating to the long-standing problems between Jews and Arabs west of the Jordan River. As for Syria, I regret to say that in a quest for a process, the aim being jump-starting something, the long-term goal of such process was actually sacrificed when we don't find in the invitation, as known to me through the newspapers, any reference to a practical, tangible result of these future negotiations, namely, according to the Camp David framework, reaching a durable, comprehensive, and just peace through the conclusion of peace treaties between the parties and the establishment of diplomatic relations between Syria and Israel. The negotiators of that form or format of the invitation succumbed to the Syrian whim with its long-standing refusal to sign a peace treaty with the Jewish state. In other words, Mr. Assad rejects even his own slogan of territory for peace, with no peace treaty in the air or in the cards. It is going to be the following slogan from his point of view: the territory for non-peace. And I don't know of too many people in the international community, our friends, people who are less friendly, that would accept even such a slogan. Mr. Farouk Eshara, the Syrian foreign minister, went as far as saying that he would not shake the hand of the Israeli foreign minister when the negotiations start. And the other part of the bad news is that up to this moment, as far as we know, the Syrians refuse to take part in the so-called multilateral negotiations, one topic of which should be, or should have been, arms limitations in the Middle East. So you combine all that, the bottom line is not that rosy. As for the relations between Jews and Arabs west of the Jordan River, between the Jewish state, the state of Israel, and the Arab inhabitants of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, in some ways, you can say that there is more progress on that track than in the former track. And maybe the most important one is that after a long-term refusal by the Arab world, except for Egypt, and by our immediate Arab neighbors in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, they have accepted, as far as we can gather, that the framework of the negotiations is the implementation of the Camp David framework for peace in the Middle East, namely the two phases. First, the establishment and inauguration of the autonomy institutions for the Arab inhabitants in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and only after 3 years, negotiations on the final status of these disputed areas with the transitional period and the positional arrangement alluding to a period of 5 years. I think that we still can entertain a hope for the following positive turn of events: that the murderers and the murder syndicate of the PLO is out of the picture. There are last-ditch, last-minute attempts by the PLO to penetrate the process in some methods and some diplomatic tricks, but I think that by now more Americans should realize and should be aware of the true nature of that gang. It was a little bit difficult for us 3, 4, 5, maybe a year and a half ago, but after Chairman Arafat ran kissing and hugging with Saddam Hussein a year ago, I think it would be more understandable to more Americans that if the PLO is in, peace is out. When the PLO spells peace, it spells W-A-R. When they're talking about a two-state solution, it spells a final solution. They are in, it's almost literally, maybe literally, dynamite. The negotiations will explode from within, with no hope for any possibility to reach a minimum degree of understanding between Israel and its immediate Arab neighbors west of the Jordan River. According to previous understandings between the United States and Israel, you might recall that a year and a half ago, Mr. Baker presented Israel with a 2-item questionnaire. To the first one, we responded positively, namely, would Israel be ready to consider on a name-by-name basis a list of possible members of an Arab delegation representing Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Not Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And not the diaspora, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So the state of Israel, the government of Israel, as you all know, has its own ways and means and methods to get an accurate knowledge about the contents of the list of future participants as delegates or as members of that Arab delegation. And according to that previous understanding with the United States government, the government of Israel is going to consider it on a name-by-name basis and confirm it on a name-by-name basis. As understood between Israel and the United States, those names cannot include an Arab representing Jerusalem, an Arab representing the so-called Arab Palestinian diaspora, and of course a member of the PLO. I would say that the only real hope for progress on that track is that the Arab inhabitants of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza free themselves from terrorist intimidation and see to it that they themselves form an alternative leadership to the Tunisian terrorist syndicate. Those who tell us from time to time, but listen folks, with no green light from the PLO, nothing would move, this is the main factor on the ground. I would like to remind everyone that the PLO is an umbrella organization of terrorist organizations, and that even if someone gets a green line from one faction of this terrorist umbrella syndicate, there would be a host of other terrorist organizations with an ability to acquire a terrorist veto on the process. If we succumb to a pressure of one group, we shall be faced with the terrorist pressure of another group, and you will know that in the last 2 or 3 years, these terrorist groups have been able to atrociously butcher more than 500 Arabs suspect of quote-unquote collaboration with the Israeli government. If an agreement is reached, or is on the verge of being reached, between Israel and the Arab delegates of Judea, Samaria, from Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, they would almost automatically be branded as collaborating with the Israeli government, and they or their families would be, of course, subject to such a terrorist pressure. So the whole trick for the sake of peace is to avoid the attempt and to repel the attempt, the last-minute attempt by the PLO to penetrate the process. They are in, peace is out, and therefore they are in, Israel is out, and there just won't be any sense of wasting time and energy and goodwill on something which might explode any day within the negotiations. I would conclude. It's not 20 minutes, Rudy? So I'm trying to be as short as possible and let you ask or comment. I think that all in all, Mr. Baker should be commended for the time and effort and energy that he has invested with his colleagues and with the State Department officials on that process. With all these reservations that I pointed out, there is a move. Arab countries, after Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel 12 years ago, are now in a process of understanding that for them the only way is to negotiate freely, openly, bilaterally, directly with the government of Israel without preconditions. I think we are almost beyond that type of a concept, that Israel is to pay a price for the readiness of our neighbors to even talk with us. And the other element, as I pointed out, is the agreement that the Camp David Accords would serve as the only basis. You would all recall that only 2, 3, 4 years ago, it seemed very strange if someone told an American audience that the Camp David framework is the only track which stands any hope for a progress on the road to peace. I remember myself having a piece in the LA Times maybe 3 years ago. They thought it was very, very interesting that a very peculiar geologist from Israel still insists out of the blue that the Camp David Accords should serve as the basis for negotiations, and they let me in on their op-ed page, maybe for that reason. But if you insist on something which is solid, which is wise, which is practical, the only practical avenue, then maybe if we embark on that with our adversaries, we will find that in the future we can arrive at least at a minimum degree of a solution with a promise for a better future. And on this optimistic note, let us have your answers. Questions, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
In your question, will you please identify yourself before you pose the question? So if there are any hands, we'll go from one place to another. Norm, please.
Norman Kempster, the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Begin, you were, I believe, leader of the group that opposed Israeli participation in earlier permutations of the peace process. Are you now firmly in support of what's going on, what's going to begin in Madrid?
The early permutation you alluded to was last year's diplomatic attempt. I think I can say proudly that I objected to it at the time, and you can see the difference between what is offered to the parties this time and the narrow scope of whatever was offered, with a great danger of a penetration by the PLO in Cairo, as suggested at the time. So we can see the benefits of some people a little bit more intransigent, if you wish, but a little bit more insistent on some basic principles. I think it served the cause of peace in the Middle East at the time. When I left Israel 2 days ago, I publicly expressed support to the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister and the Foreign Minister of Israel when they told us, the Israeli public, that they would recommend to the Israeli government that they should accept the invitation as issued by President Bush and President Gorbachev. So yes, with all the reservations that I just portrayed, just so that we know what reality lies ahead, I do support a positive response by the Israeli government. You are aware, of course, of the fact that these last-ditch attempts by the PLO to penetrate and destruct the process are not conducive to a positive result, and the government of Israel is still in a position by which it has to confirm on a name-by-name basis the list of Arab delegates of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Otherwise, if this is okay, we go to Madrid, and I'll be as hopeful as anyone else.
Dan Raviv, I'm with CBS. Your opening statement didn't talk about any concern about the level of U.S. support for the Israeli position. Are you concerned that the U.S. has broken away from some of the key positions?
I thought I would refer to that issue obliquely when I told you about my Denver experience. And I think that it would be detrimental to the process, if peace is to be reached at the end of it, if any of the sponsors and any of the indirect participants, such as the European community, would prejudge the outcome by voicing its opinion on the possible result of the negotiations. I hope that the U.S. government, and I think I have some grounds for that, would, for the sake of the process, refrain from expressing its long-standing views, to which it is, of course, totally entitled. But since we in Israel are to take the brunt of whatever consequence ensues from the negotiations and from their conclusion, I think that ultimately it would be on our government, our elected government. This is, after all, the one and only democracy from the western shores of Africa to the Indian subcontinent. So it will be up to our leaders to decide what they can accept and what they can't. I think that at least for a while, and this is the source of the hope, or one of the sources of the hope I expressed, since we know that for the time being, several months, we shall discuss the implementation of the Camp David Accords and final status issues relating to Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are to be deferred by the mechanism as described in the invitation to the negotiations, that not too much friction should occur between the parties. Israel already 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, was very generous in some concrete proposals as to the transfer of powers and responsibilities from the Israeli government to the Arab elected administrative council, that is the autonomy organ, to be inaugurated once we reach its terms of reference. So there shouldn't be too many problems unless, again, terrorism tries to penetrate and to dictate the result. With that, there is no hope.
U.S.-Israeli relations, do you fear that the outcome of the conference could damage those relations?
No, and on the contrary, if we're hopeful that the outcome would be positive, then everyone should be happy, including our American friends. I don't see a prima facie reason for that, and let's be hopeful.
Mr. Begin, would
you know that I can't see you because there's a lot of light in my eyes, but that's now you can really interrogate me. Don't ask. Interrogate.
No, well, let me not take any unfair advantage. My name is Christopher Hitchens. I'm with the Harper's Magazine. Mr. Begin, would you consider it fair if someone were to say that by withdrawing from the Sinai and dismantling Israeli settlement there, your father had made the Sinai Judenrein?
No, I think that the Egyptians are the ones who insisted that Israelis and Jews cannot live in the Sinai Peninsula. And I think it's a very bad precedent. I think that many would agree that it takes a lot out of the peace atmosphere that should have been there between Israel and Egypt. And as it relates to future negotiations, let me say that I have accepted in the past Dr. Kissinger's definition of the Egyptian, of the Egyptian-Israeli negotiations and their conclusion. Dr. Kissinger said at the time that the Egyptian-Israeli treaty means that Israel traded tangibles for intangibles. And you know that Egypt has not even delivered fully the intangibles. I'm saying that because it is important to note what kind of an ambience we live in. We live in an ambience of dictatorships. We live in an ambience of one-bullet regimes, very violent, most of the violence occasionally directed towards the State of Israel. And when I'm asked by an Israeli citizen, can you vouch that the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty is irreversible, my candid answer is that no, I cannot. With one-bullet regime and with the uprise of fundamentalist Islam and with the type of cartoons and articles and editorials that the Egyptian elite feeds the Egyptian masses, this is not a recipe for a long-term peaceful situation. And therefore it relates to your question, because if people insist that something happens in Judea and Samaria, say, and God forbid from our point of view, it is under foreign sovereignty, with no ability for Jews to live in towns and villages established there already, or some that will be established in the future, if this is the case, and no Jews will have a right to live in their own country, in their own land, though under different sovereignty, which is not my solution, as you all know, this is not the most conducive vehicle to good and fair and peaceful prospects for any kind of a future.
Yes, I'm Saul Friedman with Newsday. Mr. Begin, do you see any possibility of any compromise, like the one you proposed in Denver, on the basis of land between Israel and Syria?
Do you want a short version or the short version?
Well, first a yes or no, and then please explain.
Okay, fine. You're also just before that flashlight, so I'm interrogated. That's okay. The short version would be no, and it has now become obvious when again the Syrians insist on a territory for non-peace. The only thing they would be ready to do once the whole of the Golan Heights, the whole of this little piece of territory, 250 square miles in area, is an announcement of a so-called state of non-belligerency, which is just too close to a ceasefire or to armistice. This is no peace. This has nothing to do with peace. It relates to the basic Syrian ambition and their clear aims and their expectations from the Madrid process, if you want to call it that way. And then there is really no room for even talk about it. To tell you the truth and be candid just makes life a little bit easier for us to explain. Life is very tough in the Middle East. It's going to be tougher, close to impossible, if Israel relinquishes the Golan Heights, that strategic part of the state of Israel since 1981, to the Syrian despots. But as this is the clear position of the Syrians, I don't think that it should have the support of anyone just on the threshold. It should just be thrown from any international, quote, court.
But it seems to me that you're leaving some room, Mr. Begin, for some sort of compromise in exchange for not non-belligerency, but a peace treaty.
No, I haven't said that. We are directed by the law of the land, and the law of the land since 1981 is accepted by the Israeli Knesset with an overwhelming majority spanning most of the Israeli Zionist parties, is that the law, jurisdiction, and administration of the State of Israel has been applied to that tiny area of the Golan Heights, which is so strategically vital to the Galilee and the northern part of our country. I sometimes switch the usual slogan, and we say today, or I wish we would say today, at least I say that today, that the Galilee is an indivisible part of the Golan, and not vice versa.
Morton Kondracki, the New Republic. Hi. You seem to be saying that a last-minute move by the PLO might torpedo Madrid yet. Would you please be concrete about what you mean and what you understand the American position on this is? And secondly, what do you understand the request of the United States might be for a freeze on settlements, and how, at an early stage in the negotiations, and how would that affect the future of the talks?
Yeah, on A, Morton, I think I wouldn't like to be concrete, or I don't think I should be concrete. But you heard the news. There was that trick of a delegation of 7, expanded to a delegation of 14, then expanded to a delegation plus a council of another 6. And we insist that all people who are eligible, who would be authorized by the sponsors to take part directly or indirectly, would meet the standards and the requirements and that were agreed between Israel and the United States. There's an agreement that no PLO member, no representative of Jerusalem, and no so-called representative of the Arab Palestinian diaspora would be a part of the delegation. I think it's a must on the background of what I just told you, and we expect the United States to insist on these criteria. We will have, our government will have, to confirm on a name-by-name basis the final list, and not a series of semi-final lists to which, after our confirmation, another 2 names are added, and then other 5, etc. I don't think that we can tolerate these types of tricks, and I think that we should be aware of what the meaning of these tricks are. A last-minute attempt by the PLO to penetrate the process in a breach of long-standing, almost long-standing, at least a year or so, understanding between the United States and Israel. And if someone asked me some minutes ago about my expectations from the U.S. government, this is one of my expectations of the U.S. government in order to afford something along the way. And therefore, our government is very much busy these days with an attempt to curb these last-minute negative attempts. As for the Jewish settlement issues in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, again, there's a short version and there's a very long version. I heard Mr. Baker several times. I'm not that much of an experienced diplomat, but I didn't hear him saying that the United States would join some other parties maybe who would insist that on a freeze on new Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. When we're talking about negotiations without preconditions, this would be an attempt to impose preconditions on the negotiations. More substantially, I would say that since the State of Israel agreed 12 years ago, in contrast to long-term views by its own Likud government and its own Likud leadership, that although Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are part and parcel of the historical land of the Jews, namely Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, despite all that, our government and our leadership agreed at Camp David that the final status of these parts of our homeland would be negotiated. From our point of view, the meaning is that we should attain, once negotiations start, at least an equal footing with the Arab inhabitants of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, or other Arab entities, states, the Arab nation, who have and presented a claim for that disputed area. That means that we must have a foot on the ground, and we must apply the basic natural right of a Jew to settle in his own country. And therefore, I would see that, if such a demand arises, as a precondition that is untenable. I don't see a similar quest directed towards the Arabs. The Arab population has increased immensely in the last 20 years or so. Far-reaching housing projects, houses almost everywhere. We don't try to impose that on the Arabs. The Arab population of Jerusalem has increased about 50% in the last 24 years. We don't object to that. They're just coming in the urban area, and that's okay, and I don't see any quest for freeze on that on any party. So the whole argument is totally artificial. It relates to maybe final status issues, and final status issues are to be discussed at the second phase of the negotiations on the implementation of the Camp David framework. Let me just, I'll be in a minute, just half jokingly but half serious, I'd like you to get a grasp of what does it mean for us, the readiness to negotiate the final status, that is the sovereignty of these parts of our homeland, namely Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Please note, I read it in the Financial Times last month, that in August, a UN committee resolved and recommended that Great Britain and Argentina should negotiate the issue of sovereignty over the Falklands/Malvinas. And the Financial Times asked the response of the British Foreign Ministry. I would quote it almost verbatim. A, the UN committee is non-representative, doesn't carry any weight. B, although the Foreign Ministry would welcome a chance, an opportunity to improve relations with Argentina, Her Majesty's position on the issue of the sovereignty on the Falklands remains unchanged. Column, it is non-negotiable. We're talking with some islands 10,000 miles away from London, non-negotiable, and we agreed to negotiate the final status of some areas 20 miles from Tel Aviv and 5 miles from my office in the Knesset in Jerusalem. So there you are, and you can judge which is an intransigent, unyielding, strong, adamant position, and which is not. 90%.
Yes, to turn Morton's question around a little bit, I'm Meredith Buell with the Voice of America. You are suggesting that there is a scenario in the negotiations that it would make it possible for Israel to agree to halt the construction of the settlements in the territories.
I don't remember myself saying that.
Is there a scenario under which you would personally be comfortable with that occurring?
No, I don't think so. And to expand just a little bit, sometimes people throw at us the so-called begging precedent. There was a begging precedent alluded to 10 minutes ago, and they allude to the other begging precedent. We're talking about the true begging, not the not the one talking to you at the moment, with you at the moment. And I think it should be realized that that so-called precedent has no relevance to the present situation. Prime Minister Begin at the time agreed to freeze A, only new Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, B, only for 3 months, and C, most importantly, only after an agreement had been reached already. What people ask now is that we admit indirectly that Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are actually obstacles to peace, which is nonsense. I think that even by now already, you can judge that that pretext and that assumption has been proven to be false. Suppose that we overcome the PLO attempts to control the process, and we all go to the negotiations. Only 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, we were told that unless we freeze Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and the Golan, nothing could be started. It is in the process of being jump-started, and Jewish settlements are being constructed. Some pundits even propose that it is the pace of Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza which finally enticed our Arab neighbors to enter into negotiations on the premises that they rejected in the past very vehemently, namely the Camp David framework. Because, this is the interpretation that I read in some articles of some pundits, because finally they understood that maybe time is not automatically on their side, being a part and parcel of a great and resourceful Arab nation. So with that in mind, I think we should see this issue in the proper context.
Mr. Begin, I'm Lars Nelson from the New York Daily News. If you could look ahead 10 years, what would strike you as a fair, durable, and lasting peace that might resolve some of the Arab grievances and would be a stable settlement?
I'm not sure that I really want to toy with that, because to look ahead 10 years in the Middle East is a risky venture. Let's go back 2 years. Let's go back to July 31st, a year and something ago. Let's go to the Hill. Let's go back and hear again the testimonies by some American experts on the character of the Iraqi regime, its responsibility, its moderation. And let's recall that 3 days later, that loony invaded Kuwait when everyone said no, he has no reason, therefore he wouldn't do it. It's a very risky venture, but I should say one thing. There is no real hope for a so-called new positive order in the Middle East without at least a start of a process of democratization of the Arab dictatorships. I think that I can say that I don't see that much American zeal in an attempt to transform the Mideastern Arab regimes towards democracy as I hear it in other parts of the world. And unless that happens, very little could be expected. There can be no doubt that since the statistics are very simple, 20 Arab states and 0 democracies out of these 20 Arab states, with these statistics in mind, you must judge whether you are a geologist or an attorney or a sociologist, that something very fundamental is inherent to contemporary Arab Muslim society, which prevents it 1 or 2 generations after it's being freed from colonialism and imperialism from reaching a state of being a democracy. And with all that in mind, whatever happens in the year 2000, Israel cannot rely on international guarantees. Their value is very close to 0, and I'm not sure from which side of the 0. And Israel will have to retain an ability to defend itself and to defend whatever peace treaty, whatever agreement we reach with our neighbors. One of the most alarming elements in the Syrian refusal to participate in the multilateral talks, I don't know if I mentioned that, is that one topic on the agenda, as I know of, had been arms limitations in the Middle East. If they refuse to do that, then not too much could be hoped, and therefore we have to be very, very cautious. I would say that in our bad neighborhood, as in a Washingtonian bad neighborhood, a cautious approach cannot be denounced, should not be denounced. Yes, we are very cautious. It is the fate of our children which is at stake.
Dan
Shore.
Hi. Dan Shore, National Public Radio.
Yes, sir.
Looking not 10 years ahead, but just maybe a few months ahead, it can be expected that there will be some kind of deadlock between the position of Israel and the Arab countries in bilateral negotiations. Do you envisage the possibility that Secretary Baker or his delegate can move from the position of convener to a mediator and make proposals of his own?
According to one of the previous questions, which is related to that one, I think that some people would maintain that it is in the cards, that it is a possibility, I should express the hope that it doesn't happen. We know the American position, and not only the Likud government cannot accept it as such, I'm talking final status issues, but even the Israeli Labor Party. There is sometimes a confusion on the degree of cohesiveness in our country. As far as I know, no country in the world, no government in the world has accepted even the more modest Labor Party platform, namely that in the context of peace, the Golan Heights, the Jordan Valley, Jerusalem and its surroundings, the northwestern part of the Dead Sea and the Gush Etzion area would become under Israeli sovereignty. I haven't heard that any American government or any other government for that sake, for that matter, agreed to that. And so the difference and the distance between these positions, which form a very wide denominator, common denominator in the Israeli public, are rather far away from the known U.S. positions related to the reestablishment of the pre-1967 borderlines as recognized as insecure as they might be. I'd like to point out, Mr. Shore, as an American, you should, I think, be aware of the fact that the present U.S. diplomacy vis-à-vis that issue is based on two conflicting premises which cannot be reconciled. A, the U.S. does not support, I hoped it would object, but it says it would not support, the U.S. does not support the establishment of an independent Arab state west of the Jordan River. B, the U.S. does not support continued Israeli occupation in these areas. Now, these two tenets cannot live together. The situation must be very clear, in your minds at least. It's an either-or situation. Either Israel controls these areas one fashion or the other, or a terrorist syndicate of the PLO/fundamentalist Hamas takes over and establishes over one night a terrorist state south of Syria, west of Iraq, and north of Libya. Americans don't need that, and we cannot tolerate that. A while ago, some Americans entertained the illusion that these two conflicting assumptions can be reconciled through the so-called Jordanian option. The Jordanian option has evaporated a long time ago. It's very hot in the Middle East, and due to that heat and friction, it almost concretely evaporated. King Hussein, in the summer of 1988, announced, and not tactically, that he severed his ties with the so-called West Bank. He cannot, he could not, he will not be able to overexpand and overextend himself to Judea and Samaria, even if he wanted to, with his plummeting economy and with the unrise of the fundamentalist Islamic forces in his own country. And even if he would be enticed to do it by the United States, funneling some enormous funds to the Hashemite kingdom, he won't be able to sustain his footprint in Judea and Samaria. 3, 4, 5 days of violent incidents there would oust him if he's alive after a week. And therefore this is out, and I'm sorry, Mr. Shore, and therefore that option is out, and the situation is very clear. He who opposes, and should oppose, a terrorist state 20 miles from Tel Aviv must accept, willingly or unwillingly, that Israel should be able to control, in this or the other fashion, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Yes, Mr. Shore.
Is it then Israel's understanding from Secretary Baker that the United States will not mediate by making proposals of its own? Has that been understood?
I'm not privy to the discussions themselves. I hope that this is understood. That's okay? Well, I'm not going to say anything important anyhow. Go ahead. It is thus understood by our people. And to be rigorous, I can only express a hope that it is thus understood and accepted by the U.S. government. it must be understood that if any party, if any sponsor tries to impose his own solution, or tries to raise his own solution, that proposal would not be the compromise at any rate. If I agree to it, I don't agree to it, that compromise proposed by any sponsor would become the minimum level and the minimum requirement by the Arab side. They do expect, and I'm sure they have expected, since our request for loan guarantees for the absorption of Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union have been postponed for 120 days, they have entertained for many years the illusion that the Israeli head would be served up to them on an American platter. That shoots them up the trees from the point of view of expectations and from the point of view of very far-reaching and extreme demands. And therefore, with that technique in mind, I think that the sponsors should refrain with all their strength, although they might be impatient, from raising any such possibility. It won't serve the process.
Due to the schedule of Mr. Begin,
We can go ahead with some...
We have a few more. I still have Mr. Benami, Larry Kohler. Mr. Tal, maybe we can do this later because we will have a session with you corresponding to our review, or this is like first sequence. Are you raising your hand or not? And Mr. Cox.
Thank you. I'm Andy Glass from Cox Newspapers. Mr. Begin, what is the argument against the status quo? I ask that because in listening to you, you've made very persuasive arguments against the deal. You've talked about a bad neighborhood, you've talked about one-bullet regimes, you've talked about no peace, peace. What is the argument against a status quo? Is there one?
There is one, and it is embedded in my bio as read to you by Ruti an hour ago. My wife and myself have been raising, in the last 11 years, 6 children. And this is a good enough reason to try and embark on a way that would positively change their future and their ability to conduct their own lives and to have a neighborhood which is more attuned to the basic rights of people to pursue liberty and happiness. I think this is a good enough reason. We have to be very careful. When I'm talking about guarded optimism, I sometimes say, I have said, that guarded optimism in the Middle East has a very special twist. You must be an optimist, but you always have to be on guard. But without that type of an optimism, it would become very, very difficult to raise children in our country. Is that a persuasive argument, sir?
It's an argument for change, but there's...
For a change for the better.
Yeah.
Some people are telling us that since the status quo is untenable, any alternative to the status quo is better. And I say, hey, wait a minute. When you are stranded on a highway in a dark, rainy night, and it's very uncomfortable, you still, that's the way I'm trying to tell my kids, you don't take the first ride offered to you, even on a rainy night, and because it is the rainy night. The rainier it is, the more careful you have to be. Some alternatives to a dim and grim status quo are even dimmer and more dangerous. So we have to pursue a positive avenue.
But I get the feeling in listening to you, with all respect, that were you to lay out a concrete, comprehensive peace agreement, were you to put it another way, were the Arabs to say, you write your own ticket and we'll sign it, you get the feeling that somehow, well, there's a trick here, we can't do it. And quite frankly, vice versa. You write the agreement and we'll sign it. That's the deal you get from the Syrians and everybody. You go, hey, wait a minute, we can't do that. Or the other way, you know what I mean? You want to negotiate.
I'm not sure I get it. I'm sorry, yeah. I'm not sure I got you right, I'm sorry.
Well, I'd say if I came to you, I'm super Arab, and I say, you write a peace, you write a fair peace, and I'll sign it. That's all I want. You write it, I'll sign it. I get the feeling that the reaction in Israel would be, hey, wait a minute, there's a trick here. We can't do that.
You have a precedent. Some of us thought, it was a trick, it would become a trick, and yet 12 years ago we traded very concrete and important tangibles, both economically and most importantly strategically, for those intangibles. The fact that we're not that happy, even with the intangibles as I described, doesn't sway most of us from embarking on a road which would be more promising. It must be more positive result at the end of that way. But yes, we should try it, we should start it, and this is the basic reason why, although I objected to the former permutation, as was described an hour ago, I do support this one with some of the reservations that I had. It is a very tricky situation, it is a very delicate one, but if there is a chance, we should be able to take it. And again, be very, very much guarded. Excuse me. Thank you.
Mr. Begin, I would like to ask you a question referring to your scientific profession as a geologist.
You're an Israeli.
Yes, I am.
Why should I respond to you in English?
There are some colleagues that their Hebrew is not so well.
I thought we could meet in a few minutes and let others do it, but go ahead with it. I'm kidding. If you insist, that's okay.
I just wanted to...
now you understand we're friends. Okay, go ahead.
You expressed very recently your willingness to run for Prime Minister in Israel, and Mr. Sharon did as well, and I wanted to know if we can predict an earthquake in about 4 years, even less.
I would refer you, Oded, to yesterday's, even today's, piece of news, that article coming from Israel. I read it this morning. The head of the seismological department in the Ministry of Energy testified before a certain committee in the Knesset yesterday. And they asked him, what is the prediction for the next earthquake? And he said a very severe earthquake could occur between the next minute and 10 years. And I concur with that statement. I know something about seismology. But that's from yesterday's newspapers. You should update yourself for that.
I'm Johanna Newman from USA Today.
Yes,
your answer to the very first question here was that you did support the peace process, despite some reservations. I wanted to ask you about the timing of your announcement that you were interested in the Prime Minister's job, and whether, in fact, you were not, putting a warning to Mr. Shamir that he'd better watch his step and that you would threaten him from the right if he misstepped in Madrid.
No, ma'am, no, not at all. This is not my way with my colleagues. I don't warn them. If I want to, I talk with them. And we are on very friendly terms. I qualified my announcement by saying that I have the intention to run and to seek the nomination of my party once and only once Mr. Shamir decides himself to terminate his service as a PM. If you want to know the truth about it, people have been asking me about the reason, so I have another short version of it. I don't know if you know, or Dad would know, that my family is only one car. It's an old Peugeot, 15 years old. And I was riding with my wife the other day in the Peugeot. It's bad tires, bad brakes, and the gearbox is leaking. And we saw the Prime Minister riding with his two cars with a detail of people there. I said, hey, that's a solution. She says, oh, great. And that's it. The kids like it too, and there we are. I'll try to be short. I'm sorry. I'm imposing on you. Yes?
Earlier you pointed out what you referred to as two contradictory premises in the American position with regard to the West Bank. I want to ask you about what might be a contradiction in a position you in particular hold, because unlike many on the Israeli right, you have not dismissed the findings and
protests of various human rights groups in Israel when it comes to alleged violations on the West Bank, nor have you impugned the integrity of those groups, as some have done. You've said that they and their allegations must be taken seriously.
Right.
Please explain to me if your way of taking them seriously has led you to any conclusions regarding human rights conditions on the West Bank that they allege, and how do you reconcile your stated commitment to remedy these human rights violations if they're taking place with your assertion that Israel must maintain some form of what amounts to occupation as far as the people in those territories are concerned? How can what they perceive as occupation, which they want to resist, be reconciled with what you say is your commitment to taking seriously human rights violations that take place when people from Israel try to repress their resistance to this occupation?
I think that you are right in remarking that I never belittle accusations on the deprivation of some human rights, whether Arab or Jews, on part of authorities. It happens in Tel Aviv. Sometimes the police abuses its own ability to enforce the law. It happens in LA. It happens in Washington from time to time. It is embedded in the attempt by democracy to defend itself, and you have to see to it all the time that these transgressions of the ability as inscribed in the law of the law enforcing authorities would not be either frequent or would be totally erased from their agenda. This is almost a daily diligent work in any democracy. It would happen in any secret service, it would happen in any police, and we should see to it that it doesn't happen either in Ramallah or in Shechem or in Hebron or in Haifa or in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. However, I should say that whatever happens, and not whatever, although some people, even with the most delicate behavior of our law enforcing authorities, would still have some grievances and would say, no, this is not enough for us. We insist on this right and this right. I would say that our position would be that the Arab inhabitants of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza should enjoy the widest possible degree of freedom unless it impinges on the security of the State of Israel. Any right, any human right, as far as my political science goes, and I have never learned political science, neither law, every right is not unlimited. And according to the American expression that I learned here, my right to wave my hands ends at your nose. This should be, I think, our attitude. The widest possible. If there is an immediate threat to the security of Israel or of its citizens, it should be removed. Sometimes removed with force. When you use force everywhere, it should be done according to some limitation, with some limitations. It should be exerted on a minimum level. If that minimum level is sometimes high, if the situation calls for it, then that's the situation, and the responsibility rests on those who try to impinge upon some basic rights for life and safety of other individuals. This, I think, would be in general my approach, and I don't see a conflict there. And if there is a conflict, it is the same conflict, equivalent to similar conflicts in any other democracy.
Mr. Benny Begin, I'm sorry. I do want to thank you.
That is it.
We can't cut it short unless we start taking one after the other, and whoever has no question is welcome to approach. I thank you all very much for coming in.
Thank you very much, and good morning.
Here's a reminder to join us tomorrow morning for a live call-in program examining media coverage of Capitol Hill and politics. Our guest will be Myron Waldman, congressional correspondent for Newsday. That's Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Coming up shortly, coverage of a hearing investigating the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI.
Earl Warren served as Chief Justice of the United States from 1953 until 1960.